Okay, now that we have a plan, it's time to start building Hangman. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a class to control the game to my project. I'm going to call this the Hangman game. And then we're going to add all of the local fields that we're going to need to keep track of everything. I'm going to need a control variable that's a Boolean to determine whether the game should keep going. And I'm going to call that keep playing. I'm also going to need to keep track of how many guesses the user has left. Of course, I also need to keep track of the answer to the solution. So let's add a variable for that. And I also need to keep a count of how many letters the user has guessed. Because if they guess all the letters in the puzzle, whether they've guessed the word or not, obviously they've won the game. I need to keep track of which letters the user has guessed, because if they try to guess a duplicate letter, I need to let them know. I want to be able to add every guess to the guessed letters array. So I'm going to need to keep track of which element is the next spot in the index where I can put data. So I'm going to use an integer variable for that. And I'm going to call it guessed letters index. And the last thing I'm going to need is something to display the puzzle to the user. And to start with, the puzzle is just going to be a bunch of underscores because they haven't guessed any letters. And I'm going to call this the word display array. I'm going to need a method that kicks off the game. We can just call this play. And then I'm going to need to set up the game. We'll call this one setup. Visual Studio has dropped open the IntelliSense. It's trying to be helpful. I'd rather it not, so I'm just going to click my mouse to make that go away. And that's going to be my setup method, which I haven't created yet. And then we're going to need to play the game. And I'm going to say while we keep playing, there's really only two steps to Hangman. I have to display the puzzle, and I have to prompt the user for a guess. When the game is over, I'm going to display the result of the game. So I'm going to tell them whether they won or lost. And this is something, if you have flowcharts and you've actually sat down and created a plan, a lot of times you can just stub out your methods and make sure that your workflow looks reasonable before you start filling in the code. And that's kind of what I'm doing here. So now let's start with the setup method. I'm going to hit Control period and generate the method stub for that. And in the setup, I need to initialize all my variables. So how many guesses should we give them? Let's say 5. Obviously, if we haven't started playing the game yet, keep playing should be equal to true. And that's going to be our control loop here. The guessed letters array, we need to initialize the size of it. And I know that there's 26 letters in the alphabet, so I'm going to initialize that to 26. We'll probably never get there, but it's good to have enough space. I also want to know that the guessed letters index needs to start at position 0. And then as I add letters to the guessed letters array, I'm going to increment the index by 1 each time. That way each letter goes on to the end of it. I also need to get the word from the player. So we're going to assume a 2-player game where one player enters the word and the other player tries to guess it. That's going to be another method. And I also need to create the word display. So based on what word the user puts in, the word display needs to have an array of that size, one for each letter. So let's get the word from the player. That's pretty easy. We'll just ask the player to enter a word. So let's say console.write, enter the word to guess, have the other person look away. And then we will read that in as the answer. And just so the other person can't cheat, let's immediately clear the console so they won't see it. The next thing we need to do is create the word display. So let's generate that method stub. And in this one, we're going to initialize what's going to display the puzzle on the screen. Now, this one, we're going to set the word display equal to a new string array, and the size of that array should be the length of the answer, because we want one element for every letter. And then I'm going to loop through this array, so up to word display dot length, and we're going to set each element equal to an underscore, because that's what we want to print out until they guess a letter. So that all looks pretty good. Now let's see if we can display a puzzle. This is probably the next easiest thing to do. So I will click on this. So let's generate a method stub. You can use control period, or you can right click the method and the context menu will come up. You can go to generate method stub. Works as well. So let's display the puzzle. We're going to want to write. Let's put a little blank line in here. Let's put the word puzzle. And then let's loop through that array. Just like we did when we were putting data into it, but this time we're going to write out the data. And we're going to put a space in between each letter. So this is where we're going to put the letter, then we're going to put a space. It's been preset to be all underscores, so it's going to put a row of blanks, hopefully at first. And we'll print out word display at position I, and that should loop through all of the characters in the word and print them out. And then let's tell them how many guesses we have left. So let's do a console.writeLine, and we'll make a little space and say you have some number of guesses left. We'll put an extra blank, and we'll print out guesses left. Just like that. Now at this point I should be able to run my application and at least see my puzzle. So let's comment out these two methods I haven't gotten to yet. And let's run this. See what happens. Nothing happens. Why did nothing happen? Because I forgot to start the game. Let's go back to program main. Let's spin up a Hangman game object. And let's call the play method. And we'll put a console.readLine at the end. Just like that. Now we've got it. Let's enter a word like Ohio. And of course it's looping forever because we never put it in a console read line. So let's fix that real quick. Let's put a little pause in here. We'll take this out in a moment. And we see we have a puzzle. It has 4 blanks, and we have 5 guesses left. I notice that this is all running together, so I'm going to throw in an extra new line character. Fix that up a little bit. Let's do that right here. And now we can continue onward. If we're going to display the result of who wins, this is probably the next lowest hanging fruit, I'll generate a method stub. And basically, if we get out of the game, if they have any number of guesses left, then they win. So let's just say if the guesses left is greater than 0, console write line, you guessed the word. Otherwise, let's do something like console write line, you lose the answer, or the word, was, and let's print the answer. Just like that. Now we're going to do the hardest piece of logic. We're going to do the prompting of the user. We need to determine whether they guessed one letter or they guessed the whole word. If they guessed the word, we need to see if it's the answer. If it is, they win. We need to stop playing. If it's just a letter, we need to check to see if they already guessed it. If they didn't guess it, then we're going to check the word to see if it's in there. If it's not, we're going to decrement their guesses left. If it is, we're going to fill in the word display with the actual letters. And one thing about string comparisons is that casing does matter. So we're going to make sure that we convert everything to uppercase. And that's something I forgot to do when I got the word from the player. So let's go to this console read line and put a to upper on here. That way the words are always in uppercase. So let's uncomment this. And let's start our prompt user method. And this is going to be a little bit more complicated code than we've done so far in the course. I want to keep prompting the user until they give me valid input. So let's create a Boolean to control that. I'll call it valid input. We'll set it equal to false. And then I'll say, while we don't have valid input, I would like you to get something from the user. So console write, guess a letter or the whole word. And then I want to determine if the input they entered was valid or not. I would like to pass this to a different method. I'm going to call this method parse input. I'm going to have it return a Boolean that I'm going to set to valid input that'll let me get out of the loop as long as they do something correct. So let's say valid input is equal to, we'll name this parse input, and we'll pass in whatever the user enters into the keyboard. Again with to upper. And the second parameter, should there be a second parameter? Nope, I don't think so. We'll just pass in the user's input. So let's generate a method stub. It names this argument string P. That's not very good. Let's name it something else. Let's call it the input. We'll take out that error message. And let's get started. So the first thing we have to find out is, did they enter a single letter or did they enter the whole word? This is pretty easy to find out. If the input length is greater than 1, then they entered the whole word. So if the input is equal to the answer, then we can stop playing. And we can return true because the user did enter valid input. They guessed the problem right. We're happy. However, if they did not guess the answer right, we're going to print out wrong answer, and we're going to take away a guess. If they only entered a letter, now we have to do some checking. First, we have to know if the letter they guessed is already in the guessed letters array. And there's a handy little function called contains. And I'm going to say if guessed letters contains the input, then we'll print out you already guessed and we'll echo the letter back at them. And then we're going to return false, because that was not a valid guess. If it is a valid guess, and it's not in guessed letters, now we want to see if it's in the word. And one of the tricky parts about Hangman is that when you guess a letter, it could be in the word more than once. So we can't use contains, because contains will only return true if it's anywhere in the word, but it won't tell me how many times or which position it's in. So let's set up a Boolean, and we'll call this found letter at least once. We'll set that to false. Now as we loop through the word looking for the letter, if we happen to find it, we're going to set this Boolean to true. After we're done looping, if this Boolean is still false, then the letter didn't exist and we need to take a guess away. So let's write that code. We're going to loop through the word. And we're going to say if the input is equal to the answer's letter at position I, we're going to convert that to a string because that returns a character and our input is a string. We have to make the types match. Then we're going to set our found letter at least once equal to true. We're going to add to our letters found, and the word display at that letter's position should no longer be an underscore. We want to show the letter now, so we're going to set it equal to whatever the user put in. Now we need to check to see if we actually found anything. So if they found a letter at least once, let's tell them they did a good job. That was a good guess. And now we need to check to see if they guessed all the letters. So if the letters found, which is the count of how many we've gotten right so far, is equal to the length of the answer, then they've guessed all the letters. So keep playing should be false. We're done playing. They guessed everything. If they didn't find any letters, now we need to take a guess away. So let's say console.writeLine, no, that letter was not found. And let's take away a guess. And then the last thing we need to do before we leave this method is to add the letter guessed to our guessed array, so that if they try to guess it more than once, it's going to be caught by the code up above. So guessed letters at the current index that we were keeping track of needs to be set equal to whatever the user inputted. And then we need to move the index to the next position, because if we don't, we're going to write every letter to position 0, and we would just keep overwriting the guessed letters, and that would be bad. And then lastly, before we're done with this method, we're going to say if the guesses left is equal to 0, the game's over. Keep playing is equal to false. And at the end of all of this, if we got all the way to the bottom without falling into a duplicate letter or a wrong guess for the word, we can return true, because it was a valid guess if it got all the way down here. So that was a pretty big method. But the prompt user is going to stay in here until this returns true. We probably want to take a little pause after we give them some feedback. So here at the end of the prompt, we're going to do console writeLine. Let's give it a little space and say press enter to continue. And then we'll put in a console.readLine. I think we've done pretty good here. Let's give this a run and see how it goes. So let's enter the word to guess. Let's do Alabama, because that has multiple letters of the same kind in there. So it's a good test. So there's our puzzle. Looks like we have the right number of blanks. We have 5 guesses left. Well, let's try A. Let's do the complicated scenario. It was a good guess. Alabama. It looks like it put all the letters in the right spot, too. That's a really good start. Let's try Z. No, that wasn't found. We have 4 guesses left, so our counter's working pretty well. Let's try to guess the whole word. Alabama. It didn't print anything. It said press enter to continue. But it does tell me that I guessed the word. And then it ends the game. So let's see where that you guessed the word is. We should probably right here tell them that is correct. Now if we run the app again, let's try it again. Let's say Ohio. Let's just type the word Ohio. That is correct. You guessed the word. The game ends. We're pretty happy.